Okay, let's build our IP transport in the form of our underlay infrastructure that we're going to be putting in place. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and say config T, and I'm going to say feature, OSPF, feature. We'll go ahead and enable PIM since we're going to be not using that, and then we'll say feature. From here, we'll go ahead and say interface VLAN so I can do SVIs. I'm just going to copy these features and go ahead and place them in every one of the other devices. So config T, and configure and paste. All right, so they are now in place. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a routing process. Router, OSPF, we'll go ahead and call it underlay infra, and I'm going to assign it a router ID. Now the router ID that I'm going to use is going to be 183.101.101/32, and that's going to be also the address that I'm going to use for my loopback interfaces. So what I'll do is I'll say interface loopback 0, and I'm going to say IP address 183.101.101/32, and I'm going to go ahead and enable the routing process. IP router OSPF underlay infra, and we're going to put everything in area 0 like we said. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my physical interfaces. So I'm going to go to interface Ethernet 1 to 2, and what I want to do first is I want to make certain that I change their state, because right now they're broadcast interfaces. Now what I want to do is I'm going to change them to a medium of point to point. And what you'll notice here is it says that I can't do that because they are layer 3 interfaces by default, and medium point to point can only be applied to the IP addressing. So it says can only be broadcast for a layer 2 interface. So currently it's a layer 2 interface. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say no switch port, and then I'll say medium point to point. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say IP unnumbered, and I want to use the loopback 0 interface. Now, just for clarity's sake, I'm going to go to that interface and I'm going to go ahead and write in a description. I'm going to say the description for this is going to be my RID, so it's going to be my router ID, and it's also going to be my underlay interface. So in other words, that's going to be the interface that I'm going to use to form my OSPF neighbor relationships with. So I'll say interface E1 1 to 2. And now all I'll do is I'll actually place that in the routing process. I'll just up arrow to it to keep from having to type it again. And sure enough, there we go. Now, let's go ahead and do the configuration for the other resources. So first of all, we'll create router OSPF underlay infra. The router ID will be 183.1.102.102. I'll go to interface loopback 0, IP address 183.1.102.102/32, and I'm going to run it in the routing process. So I'll say route IP router OSPF underlay infra area 0000. And also what I want to do is I'll go ahead and use that description again. So I'll say description, and we will say our RID and our underlay interface. That's what we're using it for. I'll go to interface Ethernet 1 to 2. I will say no switch port. I will say medium point to point. I will say IP unnumbered, and I want to use loopback 0 as the IP address for both of these interfaces. And then what I'll do is run those in the routing process. And no shut. Let me make sure I no shut these interfaces over here. I have a bad habit of forgetting that. No shut. All right. So let's do the spines. So from spine 102's perspective, again, router, OSPF, underlay, infra. My router ID will be 183.1.201.201. I will go to interface loopback 0. I will say description. And we will say router ID and underlay interface. IP address 183.1.201.201/32. IP router OSPF underlay infra area 0. Interface E1122, so that's going to be the same two interfaces. No switch port. We'll say medium point to point. We will also go so far as to say IP unnumbered loopback 0, and I'm going to run it in the routing process, and I will no shut. Let's go ahead and do 9K4, which is going to be spine 202. So router OSPF, we will say underlay infra, router ID will be 183.1.202.202. We'll go ahead and configure that under the loopback interface, IP address 183.1.202.202/32, and IP router OSPF underlay infra area 0. Then we'll do the two physical interfaces, interface Ethernet 1.1 to 2, no switch port, medium, point to point. Then what we'll do is we will go ahead and say IP unnumbered, loopback 0, and we'll run the routing process. And then we'll no shut. Also, another thing I'm going to go ahead and do just to streamline things is I'm going to say IP OSPF network point to point on each of these interfaces. So we'll say IP OSPF network point to point. And where am I? Yeah, I'm in the range. So IP OSPF network point to point and IP OSPF network point to point. So at this particular juncture, we should actually be able to see neighbors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say terminal monitor just to see if everything is coming to the screen. Yes, it is. So from this particular scenario, I will say show IP OSPF neighbors. And what we'll see here is I have a neighbor with 201, but I don't have a neighbor with 202 yet. So let's see and show IP OSPF neighbors. So 201, so 202's got a problem. So let's see, no shut. We did that already. Oh, routing process. I used the wrong name. So we'll come up here and say infra. Show IP OSPF neighbors. Should have two neighbors. I've got one with leaf 102. Nothing with 101 yet. There it is. So now looking at this, we should actually be able to see some things. So what we'll do is we'll say show. Let's just do a clear screen to get it off. And then what we'll do is show IP OSPF neighbors. And what we'll see here is that we have a neighbor adjacency with spine 201 and spine 202. And everything seems to be good to go there. Let's go ahead and try it from the perspective of leaf 2. Show IP OSPF neighbors. We should have two. Spine 101. spine 201 and spine 202. That's good to go. Another thing I'm going to do, just to make these show commands make a little bit more sense, is I'm going to come in and configure an IP host configuration. So I'm going to say IP host, we'll say leaf 101 is going to equal 183.1.101.101. We'll come up and say leaf 2 is going to be 102.102. We will say our spine 201 is going to equal 201.201, and I'll repeat this for 202 and just go ahead and say that's spine 202. And what I want to do is I'm going to copy this into all of my devices as well. Now, if this were iOS, when I execute the show IP OSPF neighbors command, I would actually see the DNS resolution based on these IP hosts. So 183.1.201.201 would show up as spine 201. 202.202 should show up as spine 202. Now, we want that same behavior in Nexus. But in order to do that, what I have to do is I have to tell the system to support name resolution. So I will say config T, router OSPF, and we'll say underlay infrastructure, and I'll say name lookup. I'll say do show IP or do show CLI history unformatted. And I'm just going to grab that syntax and paste it into all of my devices also. Okay, so now let's see what happens. And show IP OSPF neighbors, we now see that it is actually resolving the name. So from the perspective of the spines, show IP OSPF neighbors, we should see that we have connectivity to the two leaves. So this makes it a little bit clearer, show IP OSPF neighbors, and we have the capability of being able to determine what we're connected to by name, not by IP address. So again, it just makes things a little bit simpler. So what we're going to do is when we come back, we're going to have a discussion about exactly what's involved in connecting the host units such that they're going to ultimately be able to ping across this IP transport. Now we really need to focus on the mechanisms that are going to allow us to be able to get this reachability, but we'll entertain it step by step in subsequent videos. Until then, I'm Terry Vinson, and I'd like to thank you for learning Data Center with me.